So in this section, we're going to answer the question, what is a factor of this polynomial? And so we're going to, in order to know what a factor is, we need to factor it. Notice here, now let's look for first a GCF. That's the golden rule of factoring. Always look for a greatest common factor. There isn't a common factor of all four terms. So next, we move on to a four-term strategy. When there's four terms, regardless of if we were able to factor out a GCF, once we do that, if we can, we move on to grouping. We group the first two and we group the last two terms. And then we just look at the first two terms and we see what we can factor out of that. And in this case, I can factor out an m squared from both of these terms, just both of these first two terms. I just put divided by m squared to help me see what's going to remain. It's going to be c minus d. And then I move on to try to factor something out of, it's going to be c minus 2d. Then I try to factor a GCF out of just the last two terms, the second set of parentheses. And in this case, I can factor out a 4n. And when I factor out a 4n, I'm left with c minus 2d. Now, folks, this is not a coincidence that this parentheses matches this parentheses. It should. In fact, I knew this trick, and that's how I caught my goof up right here when I missed that -2. I was kind of working ahead mentally and seeing that I'd have a -2 right here. I'm like, oh, that doesn't match. That's because I goofed up. So now last step, folks. You just take your, I call them mini GCFs, because they're not GCFs of all four terms. They're just of the two terms. You put them together to make sure the second one, you put the sign in front of it with, in this case, that sign's positive. Holding off to sneeze. I did it. Nice job, Mr. Pischke. All right. So I grouped together the mini GCFs, and then I multiplied by the matching parentheses, just one set of the parentheses. I just bring down one of the c minus 2d's. And folks, if you go back, so this is factored now. Seems like kind of a weird magical process, but if you FOIL this back together, this is factored form. If you FOIL this back together, you'll see that you actually get that, which is really cool. It's a nice way to check your answers. It's beautiful when we can do that in math, and oftentimes we can. Let's try 33. So 33. I do not see a GCF. Nope, I was thinking 8 for a while, and then that one right there ruined it. So group the first two and the last two. By the way, folks, there's one trick that I'm going to make sure, or one sticky situation that can happen. I'm going to make sure we do that on the next one. But if I just look at these first two terms, I can factor an 8 and an x out of both of them. So I'm going to divide them both by 8x and 8x to figure out what remains in the parentheses. A 7y minus 8 stays in the parentheses. What can I factor out of this second parentheses? I can factor a 7 out. It'd be a positive 7, so I'm going to put a plus 7, and then I'm left with 7y minus 8. Hey, these match. Coincidence? Nope. They need to. And if they don't, change what you're factoring out so they do. I mean, you got to factor things out correctly, but look at positives and negatives and whatnot. So I got the 8x plus 7y from taking my mini GCFs and putting them together. And then I multiply that by a 7y minus 8, one of the matching parentheses. And that's it. All right, so here's some of the tricky situations that can happen. I'm going to do number 36, and I'm going to do number 35. So 36, the tricky thing is right here. When specifically your third term is negative. Here's my third term, and it is negative. We need to make sure, in fact, I'm just going to rewrite this. We need to make sure that when we put our two parentheses down, and notice there is no GCF, so I'm not jumping the gun there. When I put my two parentheses down, I have the negative sign for that third term in the parentheses. If you don't, it's going to be wrong with this process, with how you have to factor that, because you've just changed that sign or the sign of the second one, depending on how you do that. So, I mean, if you're careful and you're doing this on paper, folks, well, I guess you are doing it on your own paper. You have to rewrite the problems. If this was a paper test, we were in person, it might help to rewrite it, or you'd have to just get really careful about how you chop, slash, and carve your parentheses in there. But let's proceed. Again, the key is if your third term's negative, make sure you have that negative sign in the parentheses. All right, let's factor by grouping, folks. So we can factor out a 2b out of these. 2b or not 2b? That is the question. Yeah, we'll factor a 2b out. All right. So notice, folks, if you're thinking, what can I factor out of this second parentheses? If you're thinking an x, that's great. But if you factor an x out, folks, you're going to be left with a negative 4h and a negative f. And if you look at this parentheses, they have to be positive. So we need to change what we're going to factor out. We're not going to factor out an x. We're going to factor out a negative x. So I could have really had a minus sign there instead of that green plus sign. We need to factor out a negative x, folks, because when I divide by negative x, it cancels out the negative, and the x cancels out as well. Negative x cancels out the negative, so that makes a positive h and a positive f. Don't forget the 4. Positive 4h and a positive f. And now my parentheses actually match, so I can regroup this. It's really just an additional factoring step, but it's probably easier for folks just to remember to put the mini GCFs together and multiply it by one of the matching binomials. There we are. All right, let's try 35, and then I think we'll be good here. So 35, I do not see a GCF. So I can factor out a 7a squared. 7a squared. That leaves me a 3z squared minus h. Now over here, folks, again, I already started doing the factoring process. I got so excited, but then I need to remember to make sure the negative sign on that third term is with the 18 in the parentheses. So what number and variable can I factor out of these the second set of parentheses? I can factor out a 6 and a b. However, if I factor out a 6b, I'm going to be left with a negative 3z squared. And I'm going to be left with a positive h. A negative 3z squared and a positive h is opposite of what's over here. It's opposite. When you have opposites of what's supposed to be in there, factor out the opposite of what you were thinking. So I'm going to factor out a negative 6b. So I'm bringing down a minus 6 or a negative 6b. And what's left inside the parentheses is a positive 3z squared and a negative 7h. Ooh, you know what? That is correct, a negative 7h. But Mr. P, oh boy, 49 divided by 7 is 7. So they do match, and it helped me catch my other mistake. Mr. P needs another cup of coffee. 7a squared minus 6b. Put your mini GCFs together. 3z squared minus 7h. So now they ask, what is a factor of the quadratic? This is a factor, and this is a factor. Hopefully one of these two show up down below. They probably both won't because of the way multiple choice on this works, but either one of those need to be down there. Either of these are factors, and so hopefully one of them shows up. All right, factor by grouping.